This is a Beggy Sisa podcast.
And right now there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of looking back, and literally looking back, in the sense that people are concerned that their computers are being tracked, that their actions are being watched by the powers that be, and it's very, very toxic.
Welcome to this Beggy Sisa podcast episode. I'm Mia Malan. Chaos and devastation is the position that South African USAID-funded health projects find themselves in. They had to close down overnight after receiving termination letters from the Trump administration on the morning of the 27th of February. But it wasn't only them. There were 5,800 such projects around the world. The bigger question now is, what will happen to the US government's AIDS fund, PEPFAR, where most of the money for these projects came from? Will that too close down? On the 25th of March, the US Congress will vote to reauthorize PEPFAR, or not. How will they vote? No one better to ask that question to than a former PEPFAR head of staff who knows the situation inside out. I'm joined by Gerard Ratavosian, who was PEPFAR's head of staff in 2022 and 2023. He joins us from Washington, D.C. He's now a Hock Infectious Disease Fellow at Duke University's Global Health Institute. Gerard, thanks so much for your time.
It's so nice to be with you, Mia. Thank you for having me.
If you were a fly against the wall right now, what do you think is happening in PEPFAR offices and the USAID building where very, very few employees are left?
Right now there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of looking back, and literally looking back, in the sense that people are concerned that their computers are being tracked, that their actions are being watched by the powers that be, and it's very, very toxic on people's ability to execute their job with fidelity and with the kind of compassion that these jobs need.
And they've all been sworn to silence, right?
Most of them have been sworn to silence, exactly. They've been giving strict guidelines not to engage with external partners across other healthcare departments like at HHS.
If we now look at the future, what we do know is that foreign aid in its current form, at least aid sponsored by the US, will look very different in the future. And the reauthorization of PEPFAR is coming up in March, and the US Congress needs to vote. Will there be a future PEPFAR? And if so, what will it look like, and for how long will it be authorized? How do you think things will play out?
There are a number of things happening. I think we can expect that PEPFAR will change as a result of the foreign aid review. And then you have, as you said, the expiring PEPFAR reauthorization, which is on March 25. As a reminder to the listeners, PEPFAR has traditionally received 5-year reauthorizations, but last year Congress gave it only a 1-year reauthorization, and that reauthorization is coming to an expiration at the end of March. How PEPFAR comes out at the other end, it's hard to predict right now, but one thing is for sure, it's not going to look the same. I think that we are entering a period where there will be huge budget cuts put on the table for PEPFAR. We're entering a period where specific elements of PEPFAR programmatic areas are being questioned. Their efficacy is being questioned. So I think we have to assume that some of the programmatic work that PEPFAR was doing will not continue beyond the 90-day period. What happens with the budget in the Congress will also impact foreign aid programming, will also impact PEPFAR budget levels as well. And there's expectation that there will be major reductions across all U.S. government spending, which will also impact foreign aid.
When you refer to the programmatic areas that may look different from what they look like now, were you referring to, for instance, that HIV prevention is not something they'd like to support, but HIV treatment they would support?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think everything is on the table. I think that there will be tough questions about every programmatic element, even beyond just regular treatment and regular prevention. I think they're going to be asking tough questions about the DREAMS program, which we know is a big effort that South Africa was a part of. They're going to be asking questions about the Orphans and Vulnerable Children program. They're going to be asking questions about VMMC. Now, we know that VMMC is a big, big component of HIV prevention in South Africa in particular. I think it's about 35 million of the PEPFAR budget for South Africa.
So the stance that the Trump administration has so far taken on HIV prevention, even though there is a lot of data to show that it's effective, Does it have to do with prejudice? Do they think people can prevent themselves from getting infected? Is it like you're not living a proper life, that's why we think you don't deserve prevention? Or what is behind it?
I think there is definitely some prejudice involved. I think you're right to suggest that perhaps they're not fully aware of how HIV prevention efforts, keep everybody safe. By protecting people's vulnerability to HIV, you protect families, you protect children, you protect, friends and colleagues, and ultimately society is healthier. I think that there's some ignorance in understanding the implications of the importance of HIV prevention. There's also, I think, an argument to be made about cost effectiveness. In a dwindling budget environment, when programs are going to be cut, we need to justify why it makes more sense to support and accelerate prevention at a time when all programmatic areas will likely need to be cut. There's a lot of ignorance, too, in terms of not understanding that we actually have some really effective science that has led to innovations in HIV prevention that are easy to use and be tolerated by people, that we really should not be squandering this opportunity to make them available to anyone who needs them. We learned the hard way through our endurance of the COVID pandemic that what happens outside our borders impacts us here in the United States. We are one planet. We are one human nation. And I think having to re-argue those issues with the administration is what we need to do so that they can understand that by preventing HIV infections elsewhere, we're making Americans safer.
I wanted to just pause at HIV prevention and apply it to specific situations. So in December, PEPFAR and the Global Fund announced that they will fund enough of the twice yearly anti-HIV injection, lenacapavir, for 2 million people over the next 3 years. Now, if you look at that argument, would it make America great? Would it make it safe and better? Lenacapavir is a pretty good argument for it, since it will prevent so many infections and it will buy so much goodwill. But now it's possible that the Global Fund may have to go ahead alone, right? Because there is resistance to HIV prevention.
Yeah, I think this is a huge, huge missed opportunity. That the supply agreement that you're referring to that was signed by a U.S. manufacturer, Gilead Sciences, it's also good for U.S. business, right? We don't know the cost or the cost per patient that was agreed to, but the fact that PEPFAR signed a supply agreement with a U.S. drug manufacturer is exactly the answer that Secretary Marco Rubio wants to know about how it increases prosperity in America. And I think it's shameful and a missed opportunity that the prevention efforts right now are being held because this supply agreement was going to make it possible that at the same time that lenacapavir, when it's FDA approved, if it's FDA approved, which they expect to happen this summer, that at the same time that this product was going to be available in high-income countries, it was going to be available around the world as well through the supply agreement. So the previous leadership deserves a lot of credit for being so visionary in executing this kind of supply agreement. And even the manufacturer needs to be recognized for its willingness to operate and supply this in settings outside of the United States. But yeah, it's the fact that prevention now is stalled will definitely mean that this is a missed opportunity to make this effective product that comes from a U.S. company available to South Africans and to others, when we know it's life-saving and we know it's easy to tolerate and we know that people want it. We know, by the way, that South African researchers led the development of. It's really, really concerning. I'm hopeful that we will be able to overcome this scenario. We'll have to do a better job of describing how important prevention is to PEPFAR. But I also am hopeful that the Global Fund and other stakeholders like South African government, others will step in to take advantage of this opportunity to capitalize on the supply agreement.
Is there any movement around a new PEPFAR head and who that would be, or if there even would be one?
We've not heard much here in Washington about personnel matters. On a normal transition, these things take time. When I was in the Biden administration, it took over a year for the Biden administration to announce John Kengazong as the PEPFAR ambassador. Then it took another several months before Congress took up Ambassador Kengazong's nomination and then confirmation. Almost a year and a half before we had a PEPFAR ambassador last time. So these things unfortunately take a lot of time. So far, there's been no word of any of that.
There's been so many things happening around USAID where staff have been placed on leave, staff will be dismissed. Do you think USAID will just disappear?
The wholesale assault that we have seen to USAID both USAID as an independent agency and then the stripping of a majority of its staff is going to mean that PEPFAR is not going to look the same as it did in years past. There is going to be a wholesale shift in the way PEPFAR's operational model changes. I suspect that there could also be some changes to other U.S. agencies that implement PEPFAR, like, for example, the CDC. We have a new Secretary of Health that was confirmed a couple weeks ago, and they're now undergoing significant reviews across HHS, which includes FDA, CDC, and NIH. So I think that there could also be some changes to CDC's global programming that will further impact PEPFAR operations. I think where all this is leading to is really a State Department-led foreign assistance effort that will be implemented through partnerships that are not going to be as diverse and complicated as there were before. And there's some consequences. I think one of the hallmarks of what made PEPFAR so unique and effective is that PEPFAR itself was not in the business of implementation, so to speak. PEPFAR created a robust interagency data-driven process that allowed for countries, communities, and implementing partners to adjust their programming on an annual basis, the process called COP programming, which typically takes place in South Africa. And all the agencies have to defend their budgets and propose new activities. I think those days are gone. I think that we're going to an era where the operation of PEPFAR will look very different. I think we have to look at it as an opportunity, perhaps an opportunity to save some money, perhaps an opportunity to do business differently in a more cost-effective way.
When you say the PEPFAR business model would look different, can you just break that down? So if there's no, say, USAID or CDC where it goes through to get the money to organizations, would it be direct grants?
Yeah, I think that there are some other areas in the U.S. foreign aid architecture that already do this kind of work. Like the President's Malaria Initiative, they do direct grants with implementing partners. The State Department can do direct grants. This is not something that they're accustomed to doing, but with USAID, a percentage of USAID moving into State Department, I think that we're going to be looking for new ways of handling those kinds of financial partnerships, but then it's going to mean likely less oversight, less connectivity to the kinds of partners that the agencies have, and less diversity in the kinds of ways that the agencies partner, because there's not going to be that kind of interagency coordination, right? And so I think that it's not going to mean necessarily that there will be a dramatic cut in the programming as it relates to the interagency. I think the operational model can actually lead to cost savings. I'm hopeful this is one of those bright spots where when you reduce the number of intermediaries, so to speak, you could actually save some money, give more of it to the program itself, and then that can hopefully lead to more productivity at the country level.
I wanted to follow up on the point that you made about your new health secretary, who, for our listeners, just to fill everyone in, the CDC is based in the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States. So the health secretary will have a lot of influence on how things in the CDC are framed. And Robert F. Kennedy has made it pretty clear that he wants to cut down on investment in infectious diseases and would rather want to invest more in non-communicable diseases. So what does that mean for HIV investment?
I think the emphasis on non-communicable diseases is good. I think that, in the United States and elsewhere, I know that non-communicable disease is a big source of mortality and morbidity. I'm hopeful that the emphasis there will not come at the expense of other programming like HIV programming or other infectious disease programming. What I'm most worried about is, as it relates to what happens at HHS, is there seems to be this kind of anti-vaccine skepticism that surrounded Secretary Kennedy's confirmation and his long history of vaccine skepticism. So I'm hopeful, and I hope that that kind of skepticism won't infect what we know to be effective HIV science, effective HIV innovations, and will not impede on our ability to put out products that we already know to be effective.
As you've explained now, it's complex, but in addition to the anti-vax views of the health secretary, he's also written a book in which he spent a considerable number of pages on doubting HIV as the cause of AIDS.
Yes, and this certainly came up in his confirmation hearing as well. He did clarify that he is neutral on the topic and he no longer subscribes to the belief that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. But the fact of him saying that he's neutral on the topic, I think, leads to a lot of doubt and suspicion that, he has not brought the kind of clarity that we needed on this issue. So that's very, very concerning. I also wanted to just flag that FDA is an important part of the work that HHS does as well. And it's because of the FDA's process of what's known as pre-approval. This allows U.S. companies to share their licenses with generic manufacturers through this FDA tentative pre-approval process, which PEPFAR implemented when it started. And that allows products that are available in the U.S. to be made available through the PEPFAR program. That's something that we also have to watch for to make sure that there's no implications to the budget of FDA or the operations of FDA that are necessary to approve products and to approve the pathways that allow these products to operate in PEPFAR countries. Like, for example, we were talking about the lenacapavir example. There's a couple layers that have to take place before a product can be available in a PEPFAR country. First, it's the FDA approval, and the FDA approval governs the approval of that product in the United States. But then there's a second tentative approval process that PEPFAR utilizes through FDA to get approval to use that product in the PEPFAR supported programs. And so that is something that we need to watch to make sure that whatever happens at HHS, there aren't disruptions to those processes that will lead to delays in product availability overseas.
Do you foresee any disruptions in the lenacapavir approval?
Right now, I think we're hopeful that everything is on track, but I think the global environment is very difficult. Like, for example, the United States has also withdrawn from the WHO, and the WHO HIV program is currently reviewing guidelines for lenacapavir. Things seem to be on track, but I think with the reduction of budget and the reduction of cooperation that the United States scientists have with WHO, I'm fearful that this will cause delays and may slow things down.
If we now look at the future, and there's obviously the gap of PEPFAR funding, because as you've mentioned, even if PEPFAR goes ahead, it's likely to be a heavily reduced budget. Where do we look to fill the gap?
The fact of the matter is there's been a reduction of aid over the last decade, if you think about it. Many of the donors have been constricting their budgets. We've seen that happen in the UK. Across the PEPFAR budget, it's been really stagnant over the last 10 years. And PEPFAR has not received any major increases except for the boost that it got during the COVID appropriations that allowed them to do some COVID mitigation programming. But now we have to aggressively look at other sources to be able to help mitigate some of the gaps that's going to be created by PEPFAR reductions. I'm hoping that this is a chance for governments to step up and commit a greater percentage of their budget to health, put more resources in healthcare systems and in human resources for health. This, I think, will impact the way multilaterals operate, including perhaps, I think, we're entering an era where multilaterals will have a greater role in implementing HIV programming. If PEPFAR constricts, one hopes that more resources can go towards the Global Fund. And Global Fund has replenishment, which we can talk about. But I think multilateral donors will have to play a greater role in global health programming. But that means that they need to do more to fundraise, right? And then I think we also have to keep our eye on the private sector. The private sector, especially in South Africa, is very robust.
You've mentioned the private sector now, but I would like to follow up on your comment about the Global Fund. So, of course, the Global Fund is there and it gets money from wealthier countries' government to fund the fund, basically. And last week, quietly, the replenishment for the next 3 years, that effort was launched. And we know that the US is the largest donor to the Global Fund. What will happen if the US just gives no money to the Global Fund?
You're right. So the U.S. typically supports a third of Global Fund programming. Historically, I think that number is about $26 billion since the Global Fund started. And in the most recent replenishment, which the United States led, the U.S. committed to up to $6 billion, which equated to about a third of the need that was established, the $18 billion replenishment ask. So it is a large part of the budget, as you say, and if the United States stops its contribution to the Global Fund, there'll be massive and deadly consequences to HIV, TB, and malaria programming, but especially the HIV programming, because that's a big part of the Global Fund's operating budget. We don't have any indications that that's necessarily going to be the case, but I think that we have to be mindful that this administration could impose conditionality on USAID. They could limit aid from the United States to the Global Fund to certain areas, and that could have implications for the kinds of programming that the Global Fund engages in.
When you say certain areas, are you getting back to that HIV prevention treatment thing?
I think so. I think that there could be conditionality to aid in certain prevention programming. They could condition aid to not go towards certain populations. They could condition aid to only be for treatment. Anything is possible. And I hope that's not the case, but I do think that we have to be clear-eyed and we have to be prepared to respond for all the different scenarios.
Gerard, if we look at this past 6 weeks, it's been a really tough period, and crises like this also present opportunities to learn lessons. What do you think are the big lessons to learn from this past few weeks?
We've all become a little too comfortable, those of us who have been in the HIV response. I think we've become too comfortable with the kinds of partnerships that we have, the kinds of programs that we've designed, the messaging that we've had for these programs. We've become too comfortable to rely on the budgets that has been given to HIV programming from donors. We thought that we were untouchable. And I think one lesson that I've learned personally and that I hope all of us are learning is that those days are gone and that nothing can be untouchable.
So when I asked one of our senior health department officials, what's the biggest lesson that he's learned? His lesson was that if you receive donor funding, it should be on your terms and not the donor's terms. That is a very hard thing to do, right?
What I would flip it is to say that we have to also understand that aid is not forever. And I think we were comfortable in thinking that PEPFAR will always be PEPFAR and we have to continue to defend its work and the money will flow. I think those assumptions have been assaulted by the Trump administration, and it's put us all on our toes to be able to wake up and really think about how we create partnerships. I hope that it means national governments will step up and in their own governments prioritize health as a greater percentage of their budgets, which they committed to do many years ago in Abuja. But one thing we know for sure is that we can't be silenced because silence equals death.
Now, as you've mentioned, this has been a wake-up call for everyone. But the one thing about crises like these is that they do speed up solutions because the pressure is so great. So have you seen any solutions or indications of solutions taken place?
For years, we've talked about co-financing, and this crisis will accelerate that co-financing discussions. It's going to mean that in a shorter time period that perhaps we're accustomed to, there's going to be an expectation for governments across PEPFAR programs to put a greater percentage of and co-finance the HIV response. And I think that's going to start happening this year and beyond.
And that's not a bad thing, right?
And that's not a bad thing at all. Exactly. I think we've seen leadership across the continent, the African continent as it relates to COVID, with the Africa CDC and the pooled procurement mechanisms that Africa CDC developed. We saw a greater emphasis on regional production of pharmaceutical products. Those are things that the continent led, and now is the moment to be able to utilize those mechanisms so that there's greater ownership and agency of the programs locally.
Gerard Ratavosian, thank you very much for your time today.
Mia, it's been a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was Gerard Ratavosian, a Hock Infectious Disease Fellow at Duke University's Global Health Institute, and is also a former head of staff at the US government's AIDS fund, PEPFAR. I'm Mia Malan. Until our next episode, goodbye and go well.
This was a Peggy Caesar podcast.